Welcome into TYT's The Conversation. I am your host, Adrienne Lawrence. And right now, I bring you a guest who happens to be a climate change expert and the US president of We Don't Have Time. That's a tech startup and movement that leverages the power of social media really to hold leaders and companies accountable for climate change. I want to welcome in Sweta Chakraborty.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for joining me. I know right now a recent CBS poll found that at least 30% of Americans know nothing at all about the Build Back Better Act. And a lot of people they really don't understand why we need it. Can you tell us, why do we need this?
Yeah, let's start with the big picture here. Let's put this in context, right? So we have the planet warming, and there's different implications for that. In the United States, it actually manifests as hurricanes, severe storm surges, droughts in the southwest of the United States, sea level rise on the West Coast and the East Coast. There's a lot of different impacts of climate change that are impacting our daily lives now. For Americans across the US, regardless of where you are, some version of the planet warming is going to be impacting your lives if it's not already. It's on the way. And so what this bill does is it really begins to think about future adaptation to this new reality of simultaneous impacts of climate change happening at the same time. So it's one thing that you have wildfires in the West Coast, but what if that's happening at the same time as severe drought, as the same time as like another Hurricane Sandy hitting New York City, a major city and a financial hub in the US? How do we begin to think about these things simultaneously? And then we also need to think about how to build resiliency. So not just adapt to a new normal, but also prevent against really being faced with the worst outcomes of some of these simultaneous impacts of climate. And so the bill really puts in trillions of dollars to improve resiliency of the United States and to safeguard Americans. That's the point and purpose of it. And much of that requires reducing our carbon emissions. And so what that means is there were provisions in this bill that unfortunately have been, looks like will be pushed out despite their importance to ensure that the planet doesn't get that much warmer. And so these impacts aren't even worse than we're already experiencing. And one of those policies is known as the Clean Electricity Performance Program. And it looks like that's getting cut, which would have gotten our United States emissions goals down by 35% to be in line with the global standards that have been set by the Paris Accords, and that we as a world will now see how we're doing at COP26 that's coming up this December. So I know that's a lot, but basically what this bill means for Americans is that we need to do our part to safeguard and make sure that we are aligned to what the rest of the world is doing so that ultimately we all win.
Yes, winning is definitely important. And when winning is simply staying alive and being able to have our future generations continue to stay alive and to thrive, you'd really think that more people would be on board. But as I understand, this bill, the Build Back Better Act, has been called the most ambitious and transformative domestic policy agenda really since the Great Society and nearly centuries of what really has been done. But I also know that not everybody is on board, where we have US Senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin. Well, that he says he's afraid of inflation and that's why he won't vote for the package. What's up with that?
Right, so that's really why we're seeing this, we're seeing the removal of this Clean Electricity Performance Program known as CEP. And that was so critical for the larger agenda to really, again, to meet those global standards of where the United States needs to be. So we are carbon neutral as a country by 2050, which supports other countries to also reach carbon neutrality, which ultimately keeps us below this threshold of warming that we know we don't want to get past. Because at that, now we're talking about runaway climate change. And again, we're seeing the increased droughts, the increased wildfires, the increased hurricanes. This is not something we want to see get even worse. We want to gain control of it now. So when you have Senator Manchin actually preventing some of these key provisions from becoming part of this bill that is due to pass, if this provision is removed, it's disappointing. But it doesn't mean that we won't be able to reach our carbon targets. So there's additional policies built into this bill that can still get us there. We can see carbon tax credits as long as that they are provided for a period of time that really incentivizes industries to transition to cleaner energy, to more renewable energy. That is something that, along with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, really pushing for air pollution reform and other policies that are all outlined in this bill, together outside of this unique program that Joe Manchin and others are trying to cut, we can still see potentially our goals being met. So that's what those in the climate space are still really optimistic about.
Well, that is something, even though we're not getting all of the benefits that we as citizens and as just individuals and human beings could truly just benefit from. And so I also heard you make a statement, a comment earlier that I'd love for you to explain. You had mentioned something about runaway climate change. What do you mean by that?
Well, what we have to remember is that when we get sick, our bodies heat up very incrementally. And it doesn't seem like much, just a 0.1 degree in temperature increase in our bodies can give us a fever. Similarly, for the planet, if we see even a fraction of an increase in degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit, now we're talking about a fever for the planet. And so if we see this incremental increase go up even a degree, so right now we are about a degree warmer than we were from pre-industrial levels, from when we really started emitting as a globe carbon into the atmosphere and methane into the atmosphere, which has created a pollution blanket, if you will, that's just heating us and causing this fever. And so if we are able to prevent that 1 degree warming from pre-industrial levels to go no further than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by the end of this century, then we still have a grip on this. That if we get to 2 or higher, now you're talking about, again, what we're seeing in the United States. We're gonna see more of that. It's gonna be more intense wildfires and more intense droughts and more intense food scarcity issues and water scarcity issues, because all of these things are tied together. If you're in California, sea level has increased 8 inches, and that is something that has significant impact on our agriculture. 2/3 of fruits and nuts for the United States comes from this region of the United States. 1/3 of our vegetables comes from this region. So if you have increasing sea level, now you're talking about saltwater intrusion into these lands that will not only impact food production, it'll impact livestock. Now you're talking about animal agriculture. So there's these implications that we need to reckon with. And the reason that we need to protect our water access and accessibility and our food security, the way to do that is to just ensure that we don't get past that 1.5 degree warming by the end of the century. That's what scientists have globally agreed upon is going to keep us at a point where we can continue to survive and thrive.
Yes, because that is something I think we all want, and hopefully we'd all want for our future, but it does require an investment and we have to get people on our side. So what do you think that a lot of people who may not necessarily see the value in addressing climate change and trying to make these changes now in hopes of being able to reverse some of the damage done, what do you think that those people are missing when it comes to the climate crisis?
Those that are still preventing policies like SEP from coming through this bill, like Joe Manchin, and other communities like Wyoming and Montana that are really, their interests are very much entwined with the fossil fuel industry. And we have to be sensitive to that. These are still millions of Americans and millions of communities that depend upon fossil fuels for their economy. But ultimately, this isn't something that is going to be sustainable. And there isn't a better, brighter, and cleaner future with fossil fuels in it. So we have to be compassionate. We have to recognize that we're talking about people's livelihoods. At the same time, recognize the reality of a transition that is inevitable. If we don't move to cleaner energy, now we're talking about a future that nobody would wish on their worst enemy. We really need to make sure that we recognize that and we do our part as the United States, as the leader of the global effort to combat this global temperature increase. And part of that isn't just really following through with our promises at home. This Build Back Better agenda needs to be implemented before COP26, before all the countries come together in Glasgow to talk about where they are in terms of reducing their carbon emissions and the role that they are playing to keep that temperature down. But we need to do that not only at home, we also need to support other countries in their efforts. As of right now, the United States has only committed a quarter of its promise in contributing to 100 billion, and we'll need much more than that, to help other countries to transition to a more renewable country as a whole. And we need to help support those countries to get off their needs of fossil fuels. And so that's also something we need to keep in mind, is not just the US showcasing by example, changing what's happening domestically, but contributing to a bigger overhaul globally that we can really be proud of.
Yes, that's something we should all be working toward for the better of humanity, not necessarily just one country. And so hopefully people will have more of that global mindset. And so I really want to thank you for joining us. And can you please tell us where the viewers can learn more about We Don't Have Time?
Yes, please check out wedon'thavetime.org. It's an application that's totally free to download. It allows you to connect with climate concerned citizens around the world, share good ideas, scale solutions, because we're in this together. We don't have time, so we have to act now.
Thank you so much for joining me, Sweta Chakraborty.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.